Brookings, and I would like to thank Bates and Bruce, of course, for those kind introductions, and just say it's a great pleasure to be here today and to be partnering with the University of Sydney and with Bates and with all our friends from Australia on this important event. We're delighted for our first panel to have a conversation with two of the senior and most influential, I think, officials on either side of the alliance, Evan Medeiros and Andrew Shearer. And so I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we'll throw it open to the audience a little bit later. Evan is a senior director for Asia on the National Security Council. He's served in the Obama administration for over 6 years, I think, now on the National Security Council.
A dubious distinction.
And has been integral, really, to the rebalance and to U.S.-Asia policy during that time. Prior to going into government, he was a senior political scientist in China Studies at RAND, and also was a senior researcher at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. And he's a leading scholar on China, U.S.-China relations in Asia. So we're delighted to have him back here again. And Andrew is the senior advisor on national security affairs to the Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott. He previously served in the same position, I think, for Prime Minister John Howard, and previous to that had senior positions at the Australian Embassy here in Washington, D.C., and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I've known Andrew for over 15 years, I think now. He's a good friend, so it's a particular pleasure to welcome him here to Washington. And I'm always very impressed when Australians come over in the middle of their summer and winter here, so to give up some of that vacation time. So thank you for that. What I'd like to start with is by noting really a few developments, I think, over the last year that are particularly interesting, and then ask you how U.S.-Australia, the alliance sort of fits into that. Because if you look back, you know, the President had a State of the Union last night, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. But a couple of things are sort of striking in terms of how the world has evolved. One thing is that, you know, the United States has bounced back beyond most expectations, and the economy is doing much stronger than it was a year ago. Really, there's now a divergence between the U.S. amongst major industrialized countries and other economies. I mean, the IMF the other day revised its numbers for most other countries downward, but for the U.S., it revised it upward. And to the extent that people used to be worried whether or not the U.S. would be able to implement the rebalance or would be there in Asia because you need to fix your problems at home was sort of the mantra. And until you do that, there's a shadow over U.S. leadership. That shadow would appear to be less so today than it was a year ago. So that's a very positive development. But on the international situation, particularly globally, there's been a significant deterioration. We've seen with the rise of ISIL during the year in the Middle East, and really the continuing implosion of the Middle East and the regional order there, and Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, and of course the tragic events that led to the downing of MH17. And interestingly, Australia was very much involved in, obviously tragically, in the response to MH17, but also in responding to the rise of ISIL and being part of that security relationship with the US as a core sort of ally in responding to that. And amidst all of that, we have the continuing sort of long-term challenges in Asia. And it's sort of funny that Asia seems a little more stable and a little less crisis-ridden than Europe. I mean, who would have thought that 12 months ago, which is sort of extraordinary, but those, long-term challenges haven't gone away. So my question is, given all of that, given a rebounding US, given global crises and problems, and given the sort of continuing long-term challenges of Asia, are we in a new strategic moment? How would you describe sort of the strategic environment, and where does the alliance sort of fit into that? What is its role going forward? So, Evan, if we might start with you, and then we'll turn over to Andrew.
Thanks, Tom. Let me begin by thanking Bates and Bruce and you, Tom, for sponsoring this conference. In government work, it's the relationships that work best and do the most that sometimes get the least attention, especially from non-government scholars. And so it's really helpful to have a conference like this, buttressed with the great report that Bates did on Alliance 21, that I think provides useful ideas, insights into how we should think about the U.S.-Australia relationship going forward. And so the fact that you've agreed to sponsor this conference and you've gotten such high-quality participation from Australia, especially the fact that we could get Andrew away for a week is absolutely fantastic. So I applaud Brookings and the U.S. Study Center for sponsoring this. The potential for this relationship is really extraordinary. It's been one of the greatest pleasures of being senior director is working on the U.S.-Australia relationship. And so let me make 2 points in response to your question about where the U.S.-Australia relationship fits. The first is a strategy point, because it's always good to start with the big, broad strategy point. And the Obama administration has been very clear about its commitment, its strong commitment to the Asia-Pacific. The president mentioned it in his speech last night. And as the president said in his speech in Brisbane, there's sort of 2 logics to what we're trying to do in the Asia-Pacific. The first is the U.S. being more engaged in the region to shape the regional security order, economic order, and political order in ways that advance American interests. But increasingly, it's also about a second component, which is working with our partners, our friends, and our allies in the Asia-Pacific to do more globally. And that is, it's not just about America doing more in Asia, it's about working with Asia to do more globally. And in that context, there is no better partner than Australia. I can't think of a single regional or global challenge in which there's not high-quality, consistent cooperation from Australia. I mean, think about the big global challenges of our time. Non-proliferation, ISIL and countering violent extremism, Ebola, cybersecurity, renovating the international trade regime, China's rise, India's rise, climate change. On all of them, there's a very active conversation between the U.S. and Australia. So I would say, in answer to your first question, Australia is at the center of our strategy in the Asia-Pacific, which, as I mentioned, has both a regional component and a global component. Which leads me to my second point, which is, when we talk about executing this strategy toward the Asia-Pacific, we've always identified modernizing our alliances as a central component of it. And we're very clear about what that means. It's not just a tagline, there are real ideas there. First and foremost, it's about making sure that the security cooperation, the security relationship between us continues to meet the threats and the challenges facing us. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But more broadly, and I think that something that is distinctly Obama and something that we've pursued very deliberately over the last 7 years is ensuring that our alliances are more than just military institution focused on deterring and responding to security threats. That's there. It'll always be there. I said that that's a big part of our alliance strategy, but it's more than that. It's about building political military institutions. In other words, the alliance is about building an institution that has an economic component, diplomatic component, and then, of course, a security component to focus on both regional and global challenges. And that derives from the fact that we are interested in building a rules-based regional and international order in which we use rules, norms, institutions including alliances, not just multilateral institutions, as a way to shape the regional security order. And that's something that is sort of fundamental to how the Obama administration thinks about the U.S. role in the world, how we think about the U.S. role in Asia, and that's a view that is perfectly shared between Washington and Canberra. And that's profound and significant, and that's what gives that's the foundation of this alliance, and that's what gives us momentum, it gives us direction, and it's ideas like that I think lead us to conclude that the alliance, both the U.S.-Australia alliance, but our alliances more broadly, are not Cold War relics. They're not something that were created in the Cold War and have just, and haven't adapted as the international environment has adapted. In fact, it's the very opposite. I would say that the work that Andrew and I have done, and we've done with previous administrations, have been focused on making sure that the alliance does evolve, both the security dimensions and this agenda of building it into a political military institution. So I think it's important when we address the regional conversation about alliances that we keep this in mind, that they're not outdated institutions. And in fact, it's the U.S.-Australia alliance is one of the most sort of modern, practical institutions that the United States has for dealing with regional and global challenges. It's very much a working alliance, and it's something that Andrew and I, we had a private lunch yesterday just to sort of touch base on a whole variety of different issues, and we both remarked how sort of practical and hands-on this alliance is. And what I mean is, yesterday after lunch I gathered up a few facts. Since 2009, President Obama has met or talked with his Australian counterpart nearly 40 times. As we all know, the president has visited Australia twice. With Prime Minister Abbott alone, they've met 3 times, they've talked on the phone 6 other times, and these are long, extensive phone calls that often extend far beyond the Asia-Pacific. Of course, we have our annual AUSMIN ministerials, lots of other interactions between our various secretaries on the margins of meetings all over the world. Basically, we consult with Australia on every important issue. And Andrew and I are regularly in contact. One of the virtues of being alliance partners is we have all sorts of fancy secure links, phone, video, that allow very easy contact. I have a phone on my desk that I can pick up and get Andrew on the phone, assuming I calculate the time difference correctly, which sometimes can be a little embarrassing if you get it wrong. But my point is simply that this is an alliance that works on a day-to-day basis. It's a good day for me when I talk to Andrew or Kim about working an issue. And I think that we've got real successes to show for it over the last few years. There's some big high-profile ones that everybody knows about. The MAGTF-Darwin, the Forced Posture Agreement, which sets the foundation for even greater cooperation in U.S. presence in Australia, close defense procurement, P-8s, F-35s. But there's a lot of stuff that I think is below the radar. Our close cooperation and work in Iraq and Afghanistan, very close consultation in the UN Security Council. I mean, Australia's presidency of the Council in September of 2013, November of 2014 was critical to several initiatives. And in response to MH17, Foreign Minister Bishop showed real leadership and was the key person driving a UN Security Council response. We've relocated a space surveillance radar to Australia. We've included cyber attacks as part of the scope of our alliance commitments. But there are economic components as well. 2015 is the 10th anniversary of the U.S.-Australia FTA. The United States is Australia's biggest economic partner, and we take that very seriously. And over the last 10 years of the FTA, exports to Australia have grown nearly 90%. The United States is the second largest source of imports for Australia. And then, of course, we've been close partners on TPP. And as all of you heard last night, the President has now asked the Congress for TPA. We're in the endgame, and we're going to get this done. But, of course, we work very closely together in the Asia-Pacific. One of the initiatives that Andrew and I worked most closely on and required very careful coordination was building out our trilateral security cooperation, that is U.S., Australia, Japan, in a way that makes sure that our military and our diplomatic establishments are working together in new and innovative ways to build an architecture for the region that addresses the challenges facing the Asia-Pacific. And then, of course, one of the biggest challenges we face is the rise of China, and that's something that we talk about and we consult about. And both of us want a stable, productive, prosperous relationship with China. We see China's rise as an opportunity. We have our concerns. There are uncertainties about China's future. But I think that we're working with China where we can to ensure that its rise is a source of stability and prosperity. And when we have opportunities, we pursue innovative ways to work with China. Two of the most recent ones are trilateral initiatives on the military and security side. In October of last year, a little known but very important trilateral military exercise happened between the U.S., Australia, and China in Australia related to survival training. And we as Americans tried to get the Australians to invite Crocodile Dundee as a sort of special guest to the exercise, but they didn't go for it. But on the economic side, we've got some interesting trilateral economic cooperation as well. In Queensland, there's a very interesting trilateral initiative between an Australian, American, and Chinese company in which they are, basically, it's an LNG export operation in Queensland to basically extract the LNG and provide it onto the global market. But that's just one of many examples of how when big questions about China's rise, India's rise come up, we're constantly in communication. We're looking for opportunities to coordinate, and we're looking for creative ways to sort of reach our shared goals. So with that, let me turn it over to Andrew. Great to see you again.
Thanks, Evan. Great to see you. And I'd just like to start by thanking the US Study Centre for having me here, and also thanking Brookings. And what I'd like to do is really add to Evan's excellent survey of the alliance, the contemporary alliance between our two countries, with some personal observations about how this looks and how it works from an Australian perspective. As both Tom and Evan said, we're facing a very challenging international environment, and for Australia in recent weeks, certainly quite a challenging domestic security environment also. If I just review last year, which I had a bit of occasion to do on the beach recently, and I think about that year, it was extraordinary for its intensity and the sort of overlapping waves of crisis. I think maybe that's too dramatic a way to put it, but we dealt with the fallout from the Snowden revelations, which affected our relations in the region profoundly, particularly with Indonesia. We launched within 6 hours a search for the missing Malaysian airliner MH370. US was very quick to send an aircraft, which is yet another practical demonstration of this powerful alliance. But we put together a regional coalition to search for that aircraft, and that search unfortunately goes on today. We had, as Evan said, the rise of ISIL and profound concerns about this phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters. And the Prime Minister was very pleased to join the President at the summit in New York on that in September. We had continuing global economic fragility. We had continuing maritime tensions in East Asia. We had cyber attacks. And we had the shooting down of, who would have thought it, another Malaysia Airlines aircraft over eastern Ukraine. So really quite an extraordinary array of different issues, and I've just picked out some highlights, or perhaps some lowlights. In our response to all of these events, the point I'd like to make is that the alliance has been absolutely front and centre. So just thinking about MH17 and the effort to recover the victims of that atrocity, we deployed with our Dutch colleagues about 150 unarmed Australian police officers to within 20 kilometres of the Russian border in the middle of a conflict zone. There were quite a few commentators in Australia who thought that this was a very foolish thing to do indeed. We and the Dutch government felt very strongly that we owed it to the families of the people on that aircraft to do that. But the thing that gave us ultimately the assurance and the confidence to proceed with that mission was the fact that we did so with this massive bubble of American ISR support around our people. And as someone who's involved in making these decisions, which are obviously life life and death decisions, the confidence that comes from having that incredible technological support, but also that really strong moral, diplomatic and political support, makes a profound difference to those decisions and empowers us to do things that we couldn't otherwise do. The intelligence dimension of the alliance has always been important, right back to the establishment of the joint facilities in Australia, but it's even more important today when I think about the other challenges that we face. So maritime awareness in East Asia, the intelligence relationship is absolutely pivotal. I think about the foreign fighter threat and counter-terrorism and the challenges we face there, where our intelligence relationship with the US and the broader Five Eyes intelligence relationship is becoming even more important day by day. And then I think of the military dimension of the alliance, and I think in the last 15 years or so, we've seen the most intense military cooperation between Australia and the United States that we've seen, I guess, maybe since the Vietnam War and possibly earlier. And today, Australian forces are serving alongside US forces in Afghanistan, which sometimes tends to be, I think, overlooked, trying to stabilise that country and make sure it doesn't again pose a threat as a terrorist haven. But more prominently, perhaps in Iraq, where we have the second largest contribution behind the United States. We've got a potent air task group operating in Iraq, and we've got special forces on the ground as well. So the military dimension of the alliance, as Evan said, is far from a Cold War relic. It's a dynamic and current asset to both our countries. And then there's the vast range of global and regional issues where we work together, and I think Evan put it really well. Australia is an open, liberal trading economy. We have a massive stake in an open, rules-based international order and trading order, and the alliance again is a powerful force multiplier for us in supporting those interests. And again, Evan put it really well. I think this is a working alliance. We talk every day about these issues. That's not to say we agree on every issue every day, but we certainly understand each other's perspectives. We support each other where we can. And if there are differences, which I have to say are few, we can find ways to work through those. And I really appreciate the contact that I have with Evan and his team at the NSC every day. The alliance is a critical contributor to maintaining our regional order during a time of shifting power, relativities. The Force Posture Initiative, I think, is profoundly important. It's a way that we can work together to shape our regional environment in ways that are positive, in ways that reinforce openness of trade, freedom of navigation, stable dealings with our regional partners. And there's a debate often in Australia about whether our alliance with the United States holds us back as a country in our dealings with our regional partners. And I just want to profoundly reject that notion. I think it works entirely the other way around. Our strong regional engagement is an asset in our dealings with the United States, and Evan and I will often talk about share perspectives about our dealings with Indonesia and Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, for example. But by the same token, a strong alliance with the United States is a powerful reinforcer of our engagement in our region. And my experience over a number of years is that our regional partners value the fact that we have close ties with Washington, that we have good access to the administration, that we understand the direction of US policy. And I think this is a virtuous circle rather than some difficult conflict that we have to manage. I'll leave it there, except for one observation which struck me watching the State of the Union last night. For a number of years, a lot of discussion about the alliance has been framed by struggling US economic growth and rampant Chinese economic growth. And I think it's interesting and just yet another sign of how quickly things are changing at the moment that we're having this meeting today against the backdrop of concern, and this affects Australia profoundly, about a slowing Chinese economy and a sense of resumed optimism about the US economy, which again is doing what it does, and frankly what I expect it will continue to do, and that is show enormous resilience and flexibility and dynamism. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you to both of you for those terrific opening remarks. I'd like to start maybe with the news of the day and with the State of the Union and with trade. So last night I felt that the President was much more forceful in his advocacy of trade than he was in last year's State of the Union. Last year there was a lot of expectation. You know, he mentioned it somewhat in passing. But last night he spent a minute or two on it. He made a case for passing a TPA. It was in the domestic part of the speech, which I thought was interesting. He framed it as protecting American workers against China, which is also an interesting frame. And he said that the United States and its allies must write the rules or China will. Also, I thought, curiously, it was the one part of the speech where Democrats stayed seated after he made those remarks and Republicans gave him an ovation. And later on, I found a quote last night, it was in Politico this morning, where Oregon Congressman Peter DeFazio said trade is number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4 in terms of things that we find objectionable to the speech, amongst a lot of other things that we liked. So clearly there's an issue still with House Democrats, but there is now a Republican majority in the House and the Senate. So my question is this going to, get done in the near future? Is 2015 going to be the year when, TPP is finally closed out? Evan?
No pressure.
Right. The simple answer is yes. The more complicated answer is, I think the President made very clear last night that TPA and TPP is now a top presidential priority. And now is the time to get it done. We're confident we can and we will get it done. The U.S., I think, is in the end game of its negotiations with TPP partners about what needs to be completed, both the market access component and the rules-making component, and the fact that we're now the President has requested TPA from the Congress is the political signal that the goal is to get it completed in 2015. And what's important is that, as we all know, TPP is a very, very significant component of our broader rebalancing strategy. TPP for us is obviously a critical economic agreement, but it's also part of our broader strategy. And we understand both the strategic and the economic advantages that flow from TPP. And that's understood and articulated at the very top. And I think that provides even more sort of reason why the administration will push to get it done this year.
Great, thanks. Andrew, what's the perspective on this debate, the Trade Promotion Authority debate, but also the broader TPP and negotiations from Australia?
Well, I just think this is hugely important. It's a totemic part of the triad, I guess, that is the rebalance. The military aspect of the rebalance is crucial, obviously, and Australia, through the Force Posture Initiative, is a key part of that. The diplomatic strand of the rebalance is obviously very important, and the President's made a number of recent high-profile and successful visits to the region, which have reinforced US commitment and engagement in the region. But I think countries in the Asia-Pacific are really looking very closely at this to see whether the United States can muster the political will, if you like, to lead again on trade issues in the region. So I think this is hugely important. Australia strongly supports the TPP.
we could maybe move from trade into the question of, you know, institutions and regional institutions. One of the, you know, few areas I think over the last, you know, 12 months where there has been, you know, where there's been a difference maybe of view in the debate in Australia and here has been on the, you know, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but that's more broadly symptomatic of you know, China's greater activism in building sort of regional institutions and other institutions. So how should we think about this? I mean, we have a security component to this, obviously, but there's also, you know, the fact that the world is increasingly interdependent, and Australia's position has often been noted as being very, you know, much between the, you know, not wanting to choose between the U.S. and China. So is the U.S. Slightly overreacting on some of this Chinese, you know, activity? It's more sort of better all round, or what are the sort of main concerns? And Andrew, if we might start with you on this.
Sure. Well, I mean, the starting point, and Evan, again, put this well, is that we welcome China's rise. China's rise has been a good thing for the region. It's been an incredibly good thing for the Australian economy and for the standard of living of Australians. So, you know, that's a powerful and important development which we've welcomed very strongly. By the same token, we're very keen to see that China makes a strong contribution to the regional structures and frameworks, but does so in a way which is consistent with the traditions that we believe in around openness and transparency. China, I think, is trying to make a stronger contribution and overwhelmingly, I think we see this in positive terms. There's been a little bit of controversy about the Asian Infrastructure Bank proposal. I mean, our position on this is pretty clear cut. There's a massive demand for infrastructure in Asia and a shortage of funds to build the infrastructure that Asia is going to need. So on the face of it, China's initiative is very, very welcome indeed. And our position is that we will participate in the bank if its governance is satisfactorily open and transparent. And there's a continuing discussion to have around that. So I don't think, I mean, Evan can pick me up if I've got this wrong, but I don't think there's a massive gulf here between our positions. And I think I think it's a welcome thing if there are new institutions which complement the institutions that are there already. But we'd like to see, for example, Infrastructure Bank be a genuinely multilateral body with open and transparent governance.
Evan?
So let me pick up the institutional aspect of your question, because from the perspective of the Obama administration, institutions play a critical role in the regional economic, security, and political architecture of the Asia Pacific, and it's something that we've invested in very substantially in terms of regular participation in the key forums like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ADMM+, and then the President's strategic decision to join the East Asia Summit, to attend regularly, and then to build that into the principal political security forum in the region. I've been to the EAS twice, in 2013 and 2014. It's extraordinary when you have 18 leaders from throughout the Asia Pacific around the table talking about the big challenges facing them. I mean, it's an action-forcing event. I think it helps set the agenda for the subsequent year. And so these institutions in the Asia Pacific, you know, they're evolving. They're not nearly as they're not as many of them, and they're not as well developed as Europe during the Cold War, but they serve critical functions. They facilitate and lubricate cooperation. They help set sort of rules as a baseline for how nations should conduct behavior. They serve as mechanisms for sharing information, and as a result, transparency, which results in greater predictability in behavior. And they also bind everybody. because part of membership is being subject to the views of others, the peer pressure of others, and occasionally the restrictions associated with membership. That's a good thing. That creates a much more predictable environment, and that's something that we think is important. 2015 is a significant year for that because it's the 10th anniversary of the founding of the East Asia Summit. It's also the year in which ASEAN has agreed to form their economic community, which we think is a good thing, and it's something that the U.S. wants to be an even more active member with ASEAN in. So when it comes to new proposals like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, I agree with Andrew. We think this is a very creative initiative. It clearly reflects a need. We think that China identified a very significant gap, which is the lack of both private and public funding available for infrastructure. The question is, how do you do that? How do you best access public and private finance to build and renovate infrastructure throughout Southeast Asia? And so when we look at the AIIB, we don't oppose it. The President and Prime Minister Abbott said this publicly after their meeting actually in Beijing. If you look at the transcript of their press conference, Andrew and I have talked about this multiple times. We've, this impression that has existed, especially in the Australian media, that somehow America was twisting Australia's arm is simply incorrect, but rather we both have questions. And as we all know, the AIIB is not even formed yet. The articles of agreement don't exist yet. So from the American perspective, how do you join an institution that doesn't even exist, and some of the basic fundamental attributes of it, like Andrew mentioned, governance, but also questions related to rules on procurement, environmental safeguards, all the sort of key attributes that are building blocks of a Bretton Woods-like financial institution. So we're in conversations with the Chinese. The Australians very usefully sort of produced a non-paper that subsequently became public with lots of questions, very useful, important questions. And we're in discussions with the Chinese about these very questions. So this notion that the U.S. and Australia and other allies are somehow intrinsically and reflexively opposed to this because it's a Chinese initiative is simply incorrect. We think it's a interesting idea, and we're in constant conversation with the Chinese about how to make it a truly multilateral institution that reflects the rules of similar institutions.
Thank you. That's a nice segue into some of the security issues, I think, because there's, we talk a lot about how strong and deep the alliance is, but I'd just like to throw out a few numbers from some polling in Australia. And Andrew, from your old institution, the Lowy Institute, but also some other polls. And it's very clear that support for the alliance is very strong. In 2013, 82% said the alliance is very important for Australia's security. There was a firm majority for basing US forces in Australia at the Darwin sort of rotation, and that went up, 61% in 2013, up from 55% in 2011. But on the other hand, when you sort of dig into the numbers on various contingencies, support is a little bit lower. Preparedness to support the US in the Middle East, only 48% agreed. And in Asia, in the contingency of a conflict between China and Japan in the East China Sea, there was even less support, 38% agreed. And another poll showed that in a China-Japan contingency, 71% of Australians wanted to remain neutral, thought that Australia should remain neutral between the US and China in that situation. And so there is this, because of China's sort of very important economic influence, sometimes it's easier, it seems, on the global issues that there's more sort of a deeper public support, but on some of the regional contingencies, it's a little trickier. And of course, there's a debate in Australia on, I think sometimes it's overblown, but on the alliance. I mean, you have some leading figures from previous governments criticizing the alliance and some scholars. So my question really is, Andrew, how should we think about this sort of debate in Australia? I mean, how, if we look over a 5 to 10 year period with all of the different crises and problems that are likely to arise, we don't know what they are, but we're pretty sure there'll be some. Is this something we should be concerned about, or is this just, something that will sort of will be easily sort of manageable given sort of the context of the particular problems as they arise?
Look, I think the starting point, Tom, is that there is incredibly strong public support for the alliance in Australia, and I think at a kind of instinctive level, Australians understand the value of the alliance. Whether or not they sort of conceptualise it, I think there's just a very powerful, deep-seated sense of comfort with the alliance publicly, and I personally take a lot of comfort from that. There is an elite debate in Australia about the alliance. I don't think that's particularly surprising. If you look at American alliances around the world, they haven't been free of controversy. So I think it's understandable and legitimate that there should be debate about the alliance, and I think in fact that's probably a healthy thing because it's so profoundly important that in any open society these things should be the subject of debate. On the polling, I'm a little bit suspicious of questions asked about certain contingencies, hypotheticals, without any context whatsoever. Would you support Australia? Would you support the United States in a conflict over X? Well, what conflict? How did it arise? Over what period? Was the build-up? Who does international opinion generally hold to be accountable? I think without those sort of layers of context, some of that polling, is a little dubious, I have to say. In terms of this kind of debate about the choice, I find it a little silly, really. I might have said this to Evan yesterday, but we hosted the G20 late last year, and on one day we had a huge photograph on the front of our newspapers of President Obama, Prime Minister Abbott and Prime Minister Abe shaking hands in front of the three national flags. And then the following day there's a huge photograph of President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Abbott signing our free trade agreement with China. So evidently it is possible to have a very strong alliance relationship with the United States, a growing strategic and economic partnership with Japan, and a very productive, mutually beneficial, broad-based relationship with China also. So this debate, it won't finish just because I've pronounced on it now, unfortunately. There'll be more twists and turns, and doubtless, there'll be future controversies about the alliance. But as I say, when something's so fundamental to your public policy, it's unsurprising it would be a subject of discussion.
Thanks. Evan, if I could ask you a slightly a version of that question. I mean, you've spoken here today, but also previously about the importance of alliances, and not just the particular alliances, but also conceptually, like why this sort of makes sense in the modern world, and they aren't just Cold War relics. But when you go back to the Cold War, to the general literature and alliances, the fear that one partner may get dragged in to a conflict because that's more important to the other is sort of a recurring theme in the debate, and it's constantly sort of brought up. Well, usually it's framed in hypotheticals, and usually it doesn't happen, but it is one of those main arguments that people use against the alliances. So as one of sort of the architects of sort of the contemporary alliance system in Asia, what would you say to an Australian sort of critic of the alliance who said, we can't get dragged into this sort of East China Sea dispute, or we need to be worried about balancing our relations with China with those of the U.S. Like, what's sort of the argument that you would deploy? Yes.
Thanks. It's an interesting question. First, I'm happy to say we've never had that conversation. There's never been such a high level of anxiety in Australia that they're worried that the U.S. is going to make some irresponsible decision that would drag them into war. So I'm happy to admit that here to date we haven't had that conversation. Number two, I would say that constant communication is essential. It's important in alliance management to have very clear expectations on both sides about what the other wants to do within the alliance and the other's sort of regional strategies. And that's especially important in sort of the information age with lots of commentary out there. Because if you were just looking at the U.S.-Australia alliance through the debates that Andrew talked about, you'd probably be pretty concerned. But for those of us sort of in the belly of the beast, so to speak, it's not even remotely like that. And as Andrew said, this notion that there's a choice is I think it's even sillier than he thinks, because we've never, ever, we would never want to put any of our alliance partners in a situation where they have to make a choice. And that applies throughout the region, especially between the United States and China. That is not an effective strategy. I firmly believe with the final point that Andrew made, which is we think our alliances are completely and totally consistent with countries in the region having stable and productive economic, security, diplomatic relationships with China. And the images that Andrew pointed to, comparing our trilat with their FTA, I just think is an interesting, useful, recent example of how it's possible to strike that balance. The United States, has done the same. If you look at our relations with Japan, the ROK, and Australia under the Obama administration, I think that you've seen just as much progress in those as we've had in the U.S.-China relationship. So I think you can do both at the same time. But communication, expectations, they're essential.
Great, thank you. We'll throw it open to the audience in a minute. Just one or two other questions. And on Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, there's some, obviously we saw last year, but also previously, what the Philippines have called sort of China's sort of creeping invasion or creating facts on the ground, in facts in the sea, I guess, in the South China Sea, in terms of more assertive policy. This arises in the alliance in terms of Australia is in a different place, obviously, than the US. The US has, I think, pushed back quite strong against that, particularly in the early part of 2014. Is that something, the sort of US sort of response, is that something that Australia would sort of be very much a part of, or how is this seen, how is this debate, and how is this challenge, and how is that dimension of the China challenge perceived from an Australian perspective?
So Australia's a trade-dependent economy, a very heavily trade-dependent economy, and 60% of our exports go through the South China Sea. So we don't have a territorial claim, I hasten to add, but we have a profound interest in freedom of navigation through that vital waterway, and we also have a huge interest in stability in the region, because obvious point, but over half a century of startling economic growth in the region has depended on stability, and every country in the region, US, China, everyone else has a massive interest in that situation continuing, so that we can continue to benefit our communities and generate growth and jobs. So we have profound interest there. We don't take a side in the territorial disputes, but we watch it extremely carefully. We're in very constant contact with the US and other countries, and above all, what we want to see is a continuation of freedom of navigation in those waters. And I don't actually think there is a difference, or certainly not a profound difference in our approaches to this. We make clear our commitment to freedom of navigation and disputes being resolved peacefully in accordance with international law. So I think our positions are pretty well aligned, and we will continue to work together very closely to ensure that there aren't miscalculations or something in the worst eventuality, conflict in that region.
So let me just add on to Andrew's point, because I agree with everything that he said. And I think one interesting way in which, or an interesting example that explains how the alliance is very practical in dealing with security challenges is, I share Andrew's concerns about developments in the South China Sea. Obviously, instability or conflict is not in either of our interests. The question is, how do you deal with it? It's a serious challenge, and it's one that we are in constant contact about. There are a variety of different elements of our strategy to respond, but one of them is working with countries in the region, both claimants and non-claimants, to make sure that they have sufficient civilian maritime capabilities, specifically Coast Guard capabilities, to understand what's happening in their maritime littoral and to protect them. And that's a useful and important strategy, but it's a real challenge. It's a long-term challenge because you're talking about building partner capacity, and it's something that takes time. But Australia has had a very significant success in the Pacific Islands with your Pacific Patrol Boat program of doing this very thing, admittedly on a smaller scale than we're looking at in the South China Sea. But that's an example how in our conversations they came to us and said, hey, we had this really interesting experience. This is what worked well. This is what didn't. And then we began talking about how to apply that to countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and how we can work both in parallel and also in overlapping ways to improve the maritime domain awareness of countries. So that's just sort of a practical example of how a very high-quality alliance can allow us to address that kind of challenge.
Thank you. Final question before we throw it open to the audience on Southeast Asia. So, Australia, I think if you ask people what the main sort of national security issues are, a lot of them are very local, very regional, whether it's, relations with Indonesia or Papua New Guinea or the refugee issue. Andrew, as you sort of look at your country's regional strategy and some of those sort of immediate problems that you face, what's the role of the alliance, if any, in dealing with those issues?
I think this is an area where Australia's general view, and I think it's a fairly long-standing view, has been that in terms of our immediate region, this is an area where the United States actually expects us to lead and to provide perhaps the majority of the public goods, to focus our development assistance efforts, to focus our security cooperation efforts. And I think that's an entirely legitimate expectation, by the way. So this is an area where actually I think the way the alliance works is this is an example of burden sharing, particularly when it comes to the South Pacific. And we coordinate closely and we cooperate closely, but we have a particular focus, obviously, on those countries and their stability and their prosperity. So I think that's the way we'd tend to look at it through the alliance.
Evan, care to comment on Australia?
No, I think Andrew said it very nicely.
Okay, great. We'll throw it open to the audience. So we'll take we'll go Chris Nelson first, and then we'll go here and over here. We'll take three at a time. So.
Thanks so much, Tom. Great discussion. Evan, 6 years and your hair hasn't turned white. How is that possible? And thank you so much for all the economic discussion. It means I don't have to ask about it, but I will quote it tonight. Bates, in his introduction, talked about Australia as a major alliance in the region. And in your remarks, Evan, you talked about working with Japan, the trilateral with U.S., Australia, Japan. It would be great if you could expand a bit on what your hopes and expectations are for working with the Abe administration over the next year or so on these issues, particularly, given the 70th anniversary and all the things that are happening. And that's a segue into my second part, so I apologize. Abe-san was just in Canberra fairly recently and gave a very well-received speech, as far as we could see, that was very interesting. in particular, because he specified some historical incidents that are, famous or infamous and still very painful for Australians. And we know that Abiy wants to come to the U.S. this year and undoubtedly will give a speech. From your experience of how his speech in Canberra was received, do you have any thoughts or suggestions as to what Abiy should say when he gets here, and should he get into history? And obviously a possible hornet's nest, but it seemed to work with you guys. So I think that helps segue back to the question, Evan, about expectations of working trilaterally with Japan on strategic issues, especially vis-a-vis China, especially in the Senkakus and things like that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman behind you there. Yeah, and if you could introduce yourself and then ask a question.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. I have a question for Evan. What is your comment of the current status of relations between the United States and Taiwan, particularly in the context of Zhu Lilun taking over from Ma Ying-jeou as the KMT chair and Chairwoman Tsai Ing-wen of the DPP forming a task force to study and work out a new mainland policy that would probably address some of the U.S. concerns? For Andrew, could you also comment on the Australian-Taiwan relations? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll do one more, just over the gentleman over here. If you could pass the mic along the road, maybe. Yeah.
Hi, Scott Harold from the RAND Corporation. Tom, thank you very much. Evan, you touched on challenges that the U.S. seeks to respond to in cooperation with Australia. I may have misheard you. I thought you mentioned the rise of China and the rise of India. As we've known, India is a cooperative partner. It's a core piece of the rebalance to Asia. So I wondered if you could expand on how you see working with the Australians to shape the positive emergence of India, and just to clarify the way in which the Obama administration is viewing India. For Mr. Shearer, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the deeper relationship between Canberra and Tokyo and the deepening relationship between Canberra and New Delhi is unfolding, and how you all see managing that so that the Chinese, which may perceive an effort to reinvigorate a security diamond or an arc of democracies and freedom, might not respond to it in that context, but might see it as a positive force. Thank you.
Thank you. Three great questions. Usually when you ask for three questions, it's because in any set of three, one or two, are sort of vague and don't really bring anything up. And so if you package them together, you definitely get one. But we have Japan, Taiwan, and India, which could be a session. They all could be a session all of their own. So maybe if we just start and you want to talk about whichever you choose, and if you miss anything, then I'll come back. So Evan, do you want to begin?
Sure.
You could do Australia, Taiwan.
Yeah, exactly. I'll do Australia, Taiwan. So, Chris, thanks for all you do. Thanks for your great newsletter every day. On Japan, look, the U.S.-Japan relationship is in great shape. Abe has been a great partner with the president. They've met numerous times, talk on the phone a lot. The president called him, as you know, right after he won the latest election. It was one of the best phone calls they've had. Look, we've got a really robust agenda with Japan in 2015. Number one, we got to get TPP done. The last big market access negotiation is with Japan. It's hard because anything important between two large economies is hard to do, but we're in the end game, and now is the time to get it done. Number two, we have to complete the process of revising our defense guidelines. Given the historic decision on collective self-defense last year by the Abe administration, that's provided more space for us to think about the roles and missions of the U.S.-Japan alliance and the ways in which we can work together on meeting both regional challenges and even global challenges. So we need to finish that process, and we're working really hard on doing that. In terms of Japan's relationship with the region, we thought that Prime Minister Abe's January 5th speech, in which he addressed history issues, was very important and significant, and his statements in it, I think, provided a very useful signal of how he and Japan are going to address history issues in this important year. So we warmly welcome the statements that he made, and we hope that that's realized throughout the year, because what we would like is a Japan that is influential, credible, active, and a strong partner with the United States in the Asia-Pacific and globally. And only by effectively addressing history issues, by promoting healing, will, I think, we achieve that kind of Japan, and they will find a very, very close partner in the United States. Let's see, John, on your question about U.S.-Taiwan relations, what I would say is, we have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. It's something that I've worked on very closely since day one at the NSC. And within that framework of an unofficial relationship, we want to have a very robust and productive relationship with the government. That's something that we work on, every day. It's, we've just gone through a difficult period. Hopefully we can move past it. Nobody likes being taken for granted. But the fundamentals of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, I think, are solid. On the last question, and Scott, your question about India, because the president's going to India later this week, I'm not going to talk in great detail about it, but one important aspect of our relationship with India and what the president's going to do is talking more with Prime Minister Modi about his shift from the look east to an act east policy, and we're looking very seriously at ways in which the U.S. and India can work more together in the Asia Pacific on a full range of issues within Asia Pacific institutions, on challenges like maritime security. What are India's perspectives? Where does India think it can make a contribution? And then, of course, we're pursuing India's role in interesting aspects of architecture. As you know, we have a U.S., India, Japan trilateral dialogue. Let's see what more we can do there, and we're looking at other options as well. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Evan. Just starting out on Japan and history, I think it's profoundly instructive that the Australia-Japan relationship, which has been absolutely critical for the region when you think about it. Australia's minerals and energy exports to Japan over more than half a century really fueled the Japanese economic miracle that sort of kick-started the whole East Asia growth miracle. This is a fundamentally important relationship for both countries. That economic relationship dates back to 1957, so right under the shadow of the Second World War, a particularly far-sighted Australian government reached out to Japan and put in place a commerce agreement. And everything that's flowed from that is based on that very raw decision by both countries to deal with history in a forward-looking, practical way, and I think that's instructive. Australia welcomes Japan playing a more active role in security, regionally and globally. We think Japan's been an exemplary international citizen for more than half a century, and we're putting increasing weight on our strategic relationship with Japan. We think this is critical. We think it's in the interests of the region more widely as well as both our countries, and we'll continue to work at that. Just on India, I don't really accept the premise that a stronger Australia-India relationship, including a strategic relationship, should cause problems for anyone. After all, we're Indian Ocean littoral neighbours, and I think that it's broadly accepted on both sides of that relationship that it's an underdeveloped relationship. And Prime Minister Modi made a very important bilateral visit to Australia in the margins of the G20, and that I think is going to kickstart a new phase in Australia's strategic dealings with India, and I think that's very welcome. And again, I think it's something that our other partners around the region will strongly welcome. And on Taiwan, I can really only echo Evan's comments. For Australia, Taiwan is and will remain a very important economic partner and we look forward to continuing that important relationship.
Okay, great. So the gentleman in the middle, yeah.
Stanley Roth, Boeing. Given your national security portfolios, I'd like to ask you a kind of specific national security question. What do you see as the greatest threat to your national security in the short term? What keeps you up tonight? And then taking, I don't know if you'd call it middle term or long term, 5 to 10 years, what do you imagine would be your greatest national security concern, threat? And I'm talking about in a traditional sense, not the strength of your economies or ability to deal with climate change or things like that, but in traditional security threats. And then how do you see the alliance, which has been the focus up to this point of this conference, helping you in dealing with those threats?
Thank you. Maria Solis there against the wall. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mireya Solis from Brookings. I want to go back to trade policy, if I may. I thought it was really interesting that President Obama chose to frame the issue as one of competition between the United States and China to devise rules for the 21st century economy. And I agree with the stagnation of the multilateral trading system. We are in a situation of decentralized competition, and any abdication of U.S. leadership would in fact result in others writing the rules of the game. However, I do see a downside, and this is where my question comes into play, in the sense that one of the biggest misunderstandings, I believe, surrounding the TPP as part of the rebalance strategy has been that this is an attempt to highlight rivalry, to exclude China, if you will, to contain China. I've long argued that it's the opposite, really, what's at stake with the TPP. It's an inducement strategy to try to bring China on board with these 21st century rules. So my question is for Evan. How you calibrate the message to your Chinese counterparts and other interested parties in the TPP when you highlight competition with China? How you make them realize it's about constructive competition, race to the top, and not an attempt at stressing rivalry and exclusion? And if you'd care to comment also on China's initiative in the APEC summit regarding moving to the front burner the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. Thank you.
You. And then the first person to catch my eye was very close to the door. So that gentleman there, yeah.
Good morning. I'm Scott Morgan. I'm president of Red Eagle Enterprises. Concerning Asia and Pacific, right now, one country we seem to be overlooking is South Korea. So how do we make sure we're engaged in South Korea so that we don't give people the opportunity to take advantage, so that the mistake of 1950 is not repeated again, where they're attacked by outsiders? And second, regarding maritime security and working on terrorism, with recent events in the western part of the Indian Ocean, area of Yemen and Somalia, so how will we see future Australian cooperation with the U.S. in that part of the region, of the world? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Andrew, why don't we start with you on this occasion?
Threats that keep me up at night, Stan, I think you'll probably all appreciate it if I say that the main one for me, today is domestic terrorism, and in particular this new manifestation of terrorism, the kind of lone wolf, single actor, small, autonomously radicalised actor. We've got a pretty high exposure to the whole sort of foreign terrorist fighter problem. I think there's upward of 70 Australians involved in fighting across Iraq and Syria. A number have returned home, and those are the ones we know about. And we just know from our previous experience with Afghanistan and returning foreign fighters, many of whom subsequently became involved in domestic terrorism, that this is a profoundly dangerous situation, and one which is getting a massive amount of attention from us. We've revamped all our counter-terrorism legislation over the last several months. We've given a sizable boost in funding to our intelligence and security agencies, and despite those things, which are all important things to have done, I think we're still, very concerned about this, and like governments right around the world, particularly in Europe recently, but Canada as well, obviously, really grappling with this terrible problem and trying to understand it and do absolutely everything we can. So I think that's the immediate thing that keeps me up. Medium term, I mean, one of the lessons I draw from last year where we found ourselves, if 2 years ago you'd said, do you think Australia will have troops in Iraq again? And do you think that Australia will conduct a large police intervention in eastern Ukraine? Someone would have thought you were mad. So medium term, who knows? I think the real lesson here is you kind of have to be ready for just about everything. I think our longer term work in the alliance to shape is incredibly important in terms of the region. But I think we're also seeing, right across the Middle East and parts of Africa, some of the terrible costs of failing and failed states, and that these security threats that seem over there and sort of, maybe you can ignore them, and maybe our publics would like to ignore them, but I think we've just been reminded again recently that these threats are not distant.
Thanks. Evan?
So I have a slightly different answer than Andrew because my portfolio is more narrow. So I'm just worried about the Asia Pacific. He has all of Australian national security to be concerned about. So I would say over the short term, my immediate concern would be an accident or a miscalculation among or between major regional militaries. So that could be the United States and China, that could be Japan or China, that sort of spirals out of control. That could sort of fundamentally change the security environment in the region. It would not be in the U.S. interests for either one or any variation of a major military accident or miscalculation to happen, because I think that would take the Asia-Pacific security order in a very negative direction. And so our policies are very much oriented toward avoiding something like that. In the U.S.-China relationship, we're working on confidence-building measures. We concluded a very significant one, surface-to-surface, between the U.S. and China during the president's trip, and now we're working on a second one, air-to-air. These are critical. It's important that the U.S. and China develop rules of the road about how our militaries are going to interact, because it is simply inevitable that our militaries are going to come into greater contact with one another. And we hope that once we get that U.S.-China framework in place, that China sort of applies similar rules to its interactions with other regional militaries. So related to that, one of the other initiatives that we've pursued since 2012, when there was sort of an uptick in tensions between China and Japan, is pushing both sides to develop crisis management mechanisms, channels of communication. And I was glad to see that just last week, China and Japan resumed those discussions. Just this week, I believe they're resuming high-level discussions on maritime issues. These are important initiatives. Communication channels across bureaucracies, especially between militaries, need to be wide open in order to avoid accidents or miscalculation. Over the long term, Stanley, what I worry about is any country in the region sort of making the wrong strategic decisions about how to advance their economic or security interests. Them deciding that this sort of internationalist multilateral system doesn't really serve their interests, and they try to frustrate it, short-circuit it, build a parallel system, or decide that intimidation or coercion is sort of a better way to get things done. Because if you're big, or if you're powerful, or if you're both, you can sort of push your weight around. And I mean sincerely that there are a variety of countries in the region that it's important work in concert with us to build the kind of international order that Andrew and I talked about today. And that's why the fact that we are so closely aligned in that vision for the Asia Pacific is important, because it means that both our countries are talking with all the big players throughout the region to ensure that this vision of regional order is one that continues to be the dominant one.
And on TPP?
TPP, it's a great question. There's no simple answer. Calibrating messages is art, not science. It's something that I've learned a lot about moving from the think tank world to the government world. And the question, it's an excellent question, and what it highlights is one of the inherent tensions that we face in China, or really in Asia policy, which is when the United States speaks, we speak to multiple audiences at the same time. We, at a minimum, there are at least three audiences. There's the domestic American audience, and of course you can break that up into different stakeholders. There's the, the China audience, which has a very particular set of concerns and lenses of perception that they view the United States through. And then there's the sort of broader Asia region and our Asian allies. And it's a difficult thing whenever the president speaks or any senior officials speak to have a message that resonates with everybody simultaneously. And sometimes it just doesn't work. And sometimes what you have to do is you have to focus more on sequential messages as opposed to simultaneous messages. It's one of the sort of one of the skills you develop over time in the policymaking world. So on the question of TPP and TPA, we've had extensive conversations with the Chinese about TPP. What is it all about? What do we mean by high standards? As you know, publicly, we've welcomed China to join TPP. In fact, we've publicly welcomed many countries to join TPP if they're willing to meet the high standards. I think the Chinese view on TPP has shifted over time. It originally, in 2011, when the initiative was highlighted, was seen as anti-China. I think many Chinese have come around to recognizing that TPP could be a very useful external force in encouraging additional structural changes in the Chinese economy, similar to the role that WTO played. So, we're talking with the Chinese about those attributes of TPP. And I think that there's a clear understanding in Beijing. It's evolved over time about what TPP is and what TPP isn't.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one or two very short sort of questions. So the gentleman there at the back, yeah, it's on the microphone, and then the lady one or two rows up just afterwards.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question for Evan is, you mentioned that U.S., China, Australia held a military survival training. I'm wondering if this kind of training could be expanded to a broader and a bigger military exercise between U.S., China, and Australia. For Mr. Schiller, if Australia is more willing to play a bigger role in promoting the trilateral military relations in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the final question, just the lady right beside. Yeah.
Hi, Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times. I have a question for Mr. Scherer. Since you mentioned Taiwan and Australia has an economic relation which Australia treasures, I wonder, do you expect a free trade agreement between Australia and Taiwan is possible? Another question is how Australia dealing with the Muslim community. One thing I'm interested to know, I think that's a challenging for many countries right now. For Evan, just quick question, which you haven't answered, John's earlier question. For the cross-strait relations with the possible new leaders from both the opposition party and the ruling party, do you see there is any challenging for the U.S. side or any expectation that the stability and the peace can still be maintained? Thank you.
Thank you. Guys, if you want to address those, but also any sort of closing comments you'd like to make, anything that came up earlier in the conversation that you'd like to go back to, and then we'll finish up. Andrew, if we might start with you.
Sure. Well, just on the question of trilateral military exercises, I mean, we're very open to building on the start that we've already made with these survival exercises. These exercises are a way of getting our militaries getting to know each other, understanding how we operate. Another good example, by the way, is the cooperation to find MH370, where we worked with the Chinese military, South Korean military, Japanese, US. All of these examples of working together are valuable. So we're very open to building on that exercise, and the rotating US Marine presence in Northern Australia is important here because one of the opportunities that presents is greater multilateral opportunities to work together with a whole range of regional countries in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, maritime surveillance, lots of different fields. So we're definitely open to building on that. In terms of free trade agreements, I think Australia's just kind of recovering from the effort of concluding free trade agreements with our three largest export markets. The next cab off the rank, as it were, in terms of free trade agreements, I would say is TPP, which, as we've discussed, is a big priority, and then probably our negotiations with India, which have got a sort of renewed burst of energy following Prime Minister Modi's visit. Lastly, on the question of engagement with the Islamic community in Australia, it's a really good question. This is absolutely fundamental. I mean, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in Australia are tolerant and incredibly valuable contributors to our society, and one of the key elements of our response to this problem has to be reaching out to people in that community. Frankly, one of the huge challenges we have is connecting with many of the people who are most vulnerable to this phenomenon. They tend to be very young, increasingly young, teenagers, disturbingly, and the established structures for engaging with those communities are not terribly adroit at reaching out to those people who tend to be living in a different world, frankly, on social media. And there are multiple stories of these kids telling their mother that they're just off to the shopping mall, and that the next thing the family hears a week later is that they're in Syria. Absolutely appalling stories. So hugely important issue, and something that we're going to be putting a lot of effort into.
Evan, any closing comments, either in relation to the questions or just generally?
Well, on the first issue of trilateral security cooperation, I agree with Andrew. We'll have to take a look at it, see what's appropriate, but we're off to a good start. On the Taiwan questions, cross-strait relations and cross-strait stability are an important component of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and it's important to us, to the United States, that cross-strait stability, both sides invest in cross-strait stability to the extent possible, and we're very impressed with the strides that have been made in recent years, that communication channels have been open, and we hope that the progress that we've seen continues in the future. On the U.S.-Australia relationship, let me just end by thanking Brookings, the U.S. Studies Center. This has been a great conversation. I think it tabled a whole variety of issues. Hopefully, Andrew and I were able to impart to you the big, broad agenda in the U.S.-Australia relationship, the fact that it's being handled exceptionally well, the quality of our cooperation. I mean, just what we're doing in Iraq against ISIL is an example of that. But we see that across the board, and this is very much a working relationship in the sense of it's part of my day-to-day work at the NSC is making sure that we are lashed up with Australia, seeking their opinions, seeking their perspectives, and making sure that we're both moving in the right direction in the Asia-Pacific and elsewhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank both you and Andrew. I think that it's a great testament to the relationship and the alliance that you both took so much time out of your very busy days to be with us for an hour and a quarter here this morning. So thank you, and thank you for your comments earlier, which were very insightful, and I think set the stage for the continuing conversations during the day. What we're going to do now is we're going to break for 15 minutes, and then we'll reconvene back here with the panel looking at the strategic and economic environment in the Asia Pacific and for the Alliance. And then we will have a short break for lunch, which will be served just outside, and then we welcome the Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, at 12:30. So with that, we're briefly adjourned. Thank you.